We are live. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. It's Tori, and today we are doing our first live stream of 2024, which is super exciting. And I cannot imagine a more fun discussion to kick off the year than with my good friend, Dr. John Mauro. And joining us as our author guest this evening is Mike Shackle, author of the Last War Trilogy. John, will you introduce yourself to the people?
Well, thank you so much, Tori, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thank you. My name is John Mauro. I'm from Penn State University, and I write for Grimdark Magazine and Before We Go blog. And Tori and I have done a buddy read of Mike's trilogy over the past few months, and so we're delighted to have him here on the channel.
And I'm really, really excited to be here chatting to you. And the many people that don't know me, I'm Mike Shackle, and I'm author of We Are the Dead and the Last War Trilogy by Glance.
So the first thing, hello everybody in the chat. Also, before I forget to say this, because I always do, down in the description box, there are links to both John and Mike. So please go check out I'm trying to remember if I put your Twitter, John. I think I did. John's link, and then Mike's website where you can find more information about the books. And you should definitely be picking up a copy if you don't already have one on your shelves. But the first thing I wanted to ask, Mike, is just kind of a easy opener question for people that are coming in and haven't read the trilogy. If you had a way of kind of condensing it into, here's the story I wanted to tell, what is The Last War about?
When I was coming up with an idea for a book to write, I had this kind of line of, the bad guys have won, all their heroes are dead, what are you going to do about it? And that really is the essence of this story. It's set in a world where the big bad guys arrived, Aragon got wiped out in seconds, Logan Ninefingers died 2 minutes later, and they've taken over everywhere, and it's just ordinary people like you and me sitting there going, oh my God, what am I going to do about it? And as a result, the heroes of the book aren't your traditional heroes. As much I think I would love to imagine myself sort of being all heroic in such a situation. Deep down, I think I'd be hiding in a cupboard hoping it all just pass me by. So one of the characters is a coward. We've got a teenage terrorist, basically, who's just angry at the world. We have a single mother who's struggling to survive. And then we have a general who thought he was the business and is now suffering with PTSD and, imposter syndrome and probably everything else he's got because his whole life crashed around him and he's a failure. So, and they're trying to deal with this awful stuff that's going on.
Yeah. Go ahead, John, if you had something you wanted to jump in with.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you too about some of your inspirations for the world building, because you've got multiple cultures there. One of them seems to have a pretty large Chinese influence, another one a pretty large Japanese influence. I know that you've lived in, 3 different continents? And I was wondering if you could tell us about some of that influence.
I was chatting to my son the other day, and I've basically either lived or worked in every continent apart from Antarctica.
Oh, wow.
So I've been around. But again, when I'd written 2 or 3 books before this, and I'd got really good rejections where people said, this is really nice, but, and things like that. And I was feeling very dispirited, and I wasn't going to carry on writing because I've got family and their Netflix shows to watch and things like that. And I heard a great quote from Joe Abercrombie about getting published, and he said, the longer you dance naked in the rain, the better the chance of being hit by lightning. and I realized that the only way I could guarantee not getting published was to give up. So I thought, I'm going to carry on writing, and I reminded myself that I loved writing stories. So I literally got a piece of paper and started writing down the things that I love. And there's samurai movies, Chinese kung fu movies, all this kind of stuff. And then I just had this image of these sort of skull-faced samurai-like warriors kicking the door in of someone's home. And I thought that would be really scary. You know, what would that be like? And then as I started building the world, I then looked at places that had been occupied. So I read a lot of stuff about France during World War II, and tales of the resistance and what they went through and life under occupation. So I stole a lot from that. And then you obviously have the Japanese, Chinese animosity towards each other that went on and things like that. So the Grill is really probably more of a samurai culture. They're the ones that wear that type of armor, where the Shulk are a bit more sort of Chinese military in style, and you've got the Great Wall that separates them and things like that as well. So I kind of just mashed all that together and then created the world and came up with names which are really easy to spell. You know, and went from there, and the story flowed really easily after that, I think.
So one of the things that we were talking about a little bit ahead of the live that I really wanted to ask you about was, we've been kind of, the term grimdark, it gets thrown around as a category or a genre quite often, and it's definitely been a very popular category or tone of story, especially I would say in the indie sphere lately. I'm curious though, because you mentioned before we went live that you didn't set out to write a grimdark trilogy. So for you, how are you defining like the genre of the story, and what is it that keeps you from saying, yes, this is, you know, absolutely a grimdark trilogy?
It's funny because I did a reading just after We Are Dead came out, and someone asked me, you know, how do you categorize that? I said, well, it is grim and it is dark. and I think that really comes from the fact that we're talking about war and occupation, and there's no way you can be in that situation without it being grim and dark. If you don't know where the food on your plate's going to come from, whether you're going to have water, whether there's going to be medical aid, and if you look at what's going on in the world today, you can see that reflected. So I think if you're going to be realistic about that scenario, it naturally becomes very dark and very scary very quickly. I think the challenge I had with grimdark as a term, though, is it's become to me a lot about sort of this grey character that's got loose morals that suddenly gets pulled into something and almost against his will does superheroic stuff, carving up a lot of bodies and things like that. And I didn't want it to be gratuitous in any way. And even though all my characters are probably quite difficult to like, I want them to feel like real people. And I just want to go, you know, what would I do in that kind of situation? So that's where I've been a bit wary about calling it grimdark, but it's not an easy read because it is brutal. I mean, it opens on someone trying to commit suicide. You know, it doesn't start on a happy, flowery moment, but that again, that's the trauma of someone who's in a situation where they've been forced there through family pressure, and they're struggling to cope and they're failing, and and again, coming from I spent a lot of time living in Asia, and the whole idea of face, you know, and comes through a lot in what I do. So the way people act because they want to be treated properly, but then also that idea of letting the family down, and you know, and the importance of your name and things like that. That all influenced what I was writing as well, which kind of made it a sort of brutal world that everyone's struggling with.
Well, and I would say that it's really difficult to write something like a, you know, military fantasy that involves an invasion and a huge wiping out of a lot of a culture, and it's gonna be in some form that kind of grim dark feel, but I like the idea of being grim and dark doesn't necessarily immediately put it into what we would consider as like the grim dark category.
Yeah, I would almost say though that if you did have that hero in his shining armor or her shining armor with the big sword. It's very easy to write stuff where you're wiping bodies out. It's like the red shirts die, don't they? You know, you don't really care about them because they're a red shirt. And I think there's a lot of fiction and entertainment as a whole where it's okay to kill hundreds of people because you don't care about them. But when you give them relatable lives, you know, and you know, a mother trying to look after a child and the choices she would have to make to protect them, then it all becomes a lot more real. And in the second book, one of the reasons I introduced a character that was just a soldier on the ground for the skulls was I was very wary of just showing them as the sort of faceless things that you can wipe out for the heroes. I wanted people to realize that everyone's someone's son and daughter, and they've got their own fears and lives that they're trying to deal with.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the things that you did so well was to create a cast of characters that spans that full range of gray morality. You've got, you know, a character in the first book on the side of the Eagle who is, you know, as dark as they can come in terms of morality, and then you've got another character, I'd say Zarik, who's at the opposite end of the spectrum, and then you've got you know, a whole cast that are everywhere in between on both sides of the conflict. And to see how they evolve over the course of the trilogy too. You know, a character like Dren, for example, the one who starts off like a teenage terrorist, and you know, he's very unlikable at first, but he became, I think, Tori, your favorite or one of your favorite characters.
Yeah, I think overall, at when I stopped and looked back at my experience over all three books, it was very close. It was very close, but I think Dren has it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll be careful of any spoiler things, but I did cry at the end of book 2 when, you know, I and you do become very attached to them, and I think it's with, you know, with Tinstra being the coward, that her opposite is obviously Darius, who, you know, you got someone, Tinstra, who's so scared to step outside the door, and Darius has just got utter glee at everything that he gets to do. So you get that sort of nice balance, and her journey over the course of the book actually becomes a lot more like Darius by the end of it, by what she's gone through. You know, it's that whole thing about if you stare into the abyss, you know, you've got to be careful that it doesn't come back, you know, and all that kind of stuff. Whereas Dren, he went from being a very selfish person, you know, and very cruel in his own way, through his anger, but by the end he finds his humanity and he finds that need to fight for the greater good and help everyone out. So that was a nice sort of growth story to tell. Yeah, even if it does break your heart at the end.
There is I've had this with a couple of other authors too, where there's a certain character at the beginning where I'm just you just want to kind of give him a good smack upside the head, and then you reach a certain point in the story where you start going, wait a second, when did I start caring about you this much? Like what? And I think that's for me the sign of a really good character author, when you can write a growth arc to that extent. And I think what was so cool in this trilogy is that there's multiple characters in this trilogy that really have almost, if not 180 growth arcs. Just, you can see how you as an author are building that character investment through the series. And you mentioned, you know, Darius, who is just, there's not much morally gray there. There's just, it's pretty bleak and dark with Darius.
He's a man who loves his job.
Exactly. That's one way
Doesn't
of
give up either.
That's one way of putting it. Yes. And what I thought was so brilliant in, you know, when you introduce us later on to a new POV character, and this isn't really spoiling anything because surprise, fantasy authors introduce us to new POV characters, of this young kid on the you know, the evil side. We've kind of built up through this first book. This is what these horrible, awful invaders are. And then we meet another character in book 2 where all of a sudden there's a humanity there. And it's almost, I almost recoiled from it at first because I was like, no, you can't make me care about somebody on the other side. You're not allowed to do that. And I loved how you built that character investment through the trilogy. I thought it was really brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah, Mattian was, but again, and a lot of my research was watching films or reading books, and you think about conscripts being called up. And there's, and you can see it in some stuff that's happened with, what's going on in the world. You see people being called up, they think they're doing this amazing thing for their country, but what they're actually being asked to do when you take away all that kind of propaganda is something really awful and traumatic. And what do you have to become to survive in that situation? To me is fascinating as an author to write about.
Yeah. So one of the themes that Tori and I especially liked, building on the discussion of character, is that of parenthood and especially motherhood. And you've got, a couple of these relationships in the book, of course, between Tinstra and Zarig, and between Yaz and her little one, that really just, touched our hearts. And especially the one, for me, the one between Tinstra and Zarig. And it was especially touching when I read your acknowledgments at the end of the third book to, realize some of the origin there. But I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a bit more about your ideas of incorporating this realistic notion of parenthood, both kind of biological as well as adoptive parenthood, in this grim world.
Yeah, look. First of all, I think mothers are amazing people, right?
It's true.
It's weird because now I've got children of my own. I wish my mother was still alive because I want to ring her up and go, like, I'm really sorry for that stuff that I did.
Yeah.
And I didn't appreciate the hard work that went into keeping me alive and fed and clothed and all that stuff, because you just take it for granted, don't you? Right? You've got these superheroes that look after you, and then as you grow older, you realize they're human beings with their own faults and fears and troubles and things like that, and they still do this amazing job. So that really became much more apparent to me as I had children. And when I started writing this book, we just had our second child. So I was very aware of that, and also the feelings that I had. And I also think in the case of Tinstra, she's she's a very selfish person at the beginning. All her fears and failures is because she's so caught up in her own head and she hasn't really got anything else to worry about. And suddenly she's forced into a situation where she has to look after another life. And she resists it all the way until there's no one else alive that could be responsible, and she has to do it. And then she attacks it with all the energy that she can, and it becomes everything to her. And I think that part of growing up, I know I had a very carefree life until I had kids. I know someone's comments about my Marvel figures in the background, but that's all the crap I used to waste my money on before I had kids. Like, I haven't bought anything good for myself since I've had kids. They've got all the, all the great equipment and things like that. But you give everything for your children, and I wanted that to come across. And I never really thought I'd read too many kind of relationships like that in fantasy. And particularly when I wanted, I'm very lucky to be surrounded by very strong women my whole life. And I wanted to capture that. And I hate fantasy books where the strong woman is a man with, probably less armor showing and, heaving bosoms and that sort of stuff, right? Because it's just, it's terrible. But, my grandmother, my father was born in 1940, right? So at the beginning, my grandfather turned up from wherever he was doing his stuff with the war effort, got her pregnant, went back to do war stuff, and my grandmother had to have a child as bombs were falling on London, and then 4 years later, my grandfather came back, got her pregnant again, disappeared again, and she then had another baby to deal with. You got rationing, you've got bombs falling on you, you're being evacuated out of your homes. And I just thought, my dad, I talked to my dad about it. He just said, I never felt scared. because no matter what happened, she made me feel safe and protected. I thought, what sort of woman could do that? What sort of person could do that? And that really inspired of a lot of what I tried portraying. And again, if I could go back in time, I wish I could speak to her about her experiences, because again, when I was a child, I mean, no one really spoke about the war and things like that then, but I wasn't aware enough to ask those questions to her, and that really inspired me in a lot of ways. And I've got a picture of her on my desk that I look at every day, because she was a wonderful woman, and really it was my way of trying to do some justice to whatever they've been through and they do for their children.
Yeah, one of the things that I think kind of stood out to me just there is why fantasy? Because I think fantasy, for me at least, and I'm sure all of us being fans of it could agree with this, fantasy offers us such a great way to take those real life inspirations and history and put it into a secondary world. And what was it about telling this story and bringing those characters that are very real and vibrant in your real life into a fantasy setting?
Right. That's a really good question. No, and I think I love fantasy books, right? And that's what I always wanted to write. But even when I started writing this idea for We Are the Dead, it was November 2016. Brexit had happened in the UK. Trump had just got in the US, and I really sat there thinking, my God, the bad guys have won, right? And I was like, where are the heroes coming to save us? And fantasy gives us the ability to talk about these stories and get a lot of your anger out in a way, without it becoming too preachy or having people go, oh my God, you're just pushing your political agenda, and I know John mentioned about some of the Asian influences. There's a reason why the country they want to escape to is called, and I'm going to slaughter the pronunciation, I apologize now, right? I might have lived in Beijing and studied Mandarin, but but Magor is Chinese for America, right? Beautiful country.
Yeah.
So there's a reason why the country they want to, and Jia is home. So that's what, home's been invaded. They want to escape to this beautiful country where they believe they're going to be free. And as I was writing it, Americans were locking babies up in cages on the Mexican border and things like that. And there's a reason why, spoiler alert, when they get to Magor, things don't work out the way they want, and there isn't that respite, because there was a lot of my anger coming out in that. And you look at the real world and you just think that kind of myth of the happy ending doesn't exist, right? You just go from one awful place to another awful situation. And if you look at the world today and how they treat refugees, and how there's a lot of stuff pushing us to resent people fleeing for their lives and not wanting to help them. If you wrote that in a modern setting, it just becomes so polarizing straight away, because people don't want to be confronted by that, but you can do it in a fantasy world or a sci-fi world a lot easier.
Yeah. So building then on the theme of bravery versus cowardice, what does it mean to be brave, to rise up to the situation in a world like this or a world like that?
Well, I think there's I can't remember who said it now, but there's a thing about it's okay to be scared, because that's how you get to be brave.
Yeah.
The person who's never scared lacks the intelligence to realize how much crap they're in, right? It's like, I was watching one of these videos, someone jumped off this bridge and fell into a river about this big, and you think, well, you're just an idiot, right? That's not bravery, that's stupidity. But I think there's that thing of when you want to run and you want to hide, but you find the strength within yourself to actually run to trouble. And there's a scene at the beginning where Tinstra runs and picks Sarik up for the first time, and that's her being brave. And that's that first essence. You go, actually, she's far harder on herself than she should be because she can do this. But that's bravery in all of it. It's when you push yourself to do something you're petrified of. You know, for some people, it could just be walking out the door. It could be sitting down and writing that book, or in this case, picking up a sword and chopping someone's head off.
Yeah, somehow managing to find that ray of light that is shining through the darkness.
And I think hope. And again, going back to the grimdark thing, I think there's hope in my book on every with every character. Right? You know, even Dren at the beginning when he's being horrible, you hope he's going to grow up, right? You want to clip him around the head and grow up, but you know, and that's got to run through everything, right? Because if it just becomes so nihilistic and dark and awful, then I haven't got really an interest in reading it. You know, I want to see that light that's drawing them forward.
That's something I really love in books like yours, because the world can be grim and dark and brutal, but I need to know that there's a perseverance and a resilience there, and we tried. No matter how the story ends up, the ending to me isn't as important as getting there and what happens on that journey, and having that through line of resilience and just what the human spirit is capable of in the worst possible situations is something that I always love reading about. And I think that was what I found a lot of hope in throughout this trilogy. Even, I mean, it is very brutal, and there's a lot of moments where you think you're taking a step forward. Only a few pages later, Mike goes, psych, and pulls the rug out from underneath you.
Well, again, I actually had a post-it note stuck on my computer which said "No one is safe." You know, there's a comic book I really love called Queen and Country by a guy called Greg Rucka, and I've got the original page that this quote is on, and the character says, "It's not the bullet with your name on that you have to worry about. It's all those marked to whom it may concern." Right? And that's the thing. And I think in these situations, you could be the best warrior in the world, but if a bomb falls on your head, you're done for, right? Yeah. And that's completely haphazard, or you run into the path of an arrow that just happens to be going your way, and it's all over. And I really wanted to keep that kind of sense of, you know, you might be cheering this person from page 1 of book 1, but there's no hope that they're going to get through to the end. And that became a big challenge in the third book, really, on, you know, my dad was pleading with me that, you know, please let them live, please let this have a happy ending and stuff. But I was very conscious of being true to that idea of no one is safe throughout this book.
I think that's a hard truth of reality, right? Like in a situation like this, you know, that you never know. There's no guarantee for anyone. I did want to run through a couple of comments in the chat to let a couple people ask some questions. Andrew Meredith says, "So great to put a face to the author, Mike. I've been talking about you a lot on my channel this last few months, so I'm sure everybody's like, oh, that's who she was talking about."
It's really funny, but on one of them, you kept referring to me as Mike Shackle. It was like this, like, combined. Yeah. And I was like, please just call me Mike. Another thing Mike Shackle did. I'm like, no, just Mike.
You know what's so funny about that is because as soon as I start referring to, especially certain authors, by just their first name, people make fun of me for it. They're like, oh, we're on a first name basis now, are we? And I'm like, well, yeah, I talked to this person. So I will just say Mike.
Yeah.
We're feeling unshackled.
I can be Mike from now on.
Yeah. It's such a great fantasy author name, by the way. Like, I always appreciate names like Mike. I mean, that's probably why I kept saying it, because it's a cool name.
It is a cool name.
Mark Lawrence says, "I'm marveling at Mike's shelf stuff." Ha
ha. Thank you very much.
Safina says, "I have purchased all 3 books of yours. Hopefully start reading them soon. Happy New Year."
That I really appreciate that. And you don't have to read them. Buying them is enough.
That's all the authors care
That's
about.
all they care about. Just buy them, put them on your TBR.
They make great gifts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Buy 2 copies. The people I really love are the ones that go, I've got the ebook, I bought the hardbacks, and I've got the audio. They're like, you know.
I don't have the audio. I have the ebooks and I actually had the paperback editions, and then I also have the book and binding, and I have the ebooks on my Kindle. So.
That's why I like you, Tori. You're amazing.
Oh, thanks. Safina also wants to know, who is your favorite author and who inspired you to write?
Well, look, I've got lots of favorite people, and it's really funny because I met Mark Lawrence at Bristol at the FancyCon recently, and I completely fanboyed and just walked away out of I can't speak to you. So I just walked away and felt like an idiot. But the obviously Joe Abercrombie's a big influence. But I read fancy growing up, and I read lots of Conan and Elric and all that type of stuff, and then I kind of stopped. And then one day I was walking through this bookshop in Singapore, and I saw this book cover, and I just stopped, and I have no idea why. I picked it up, and it was The Warded Man by Peter V. Brett. And I bought it, and I read it, and it felt like he'd written this book just for me. It had everything that I loved, you know, particularly used to love about fantasy, and it reawoke all these feelings. And that, from reading him, I discovered Joe Abercrombie, then Scott Lynch, then Patrick Rothfuss, and then went obviously back into George Martin and things like that, and then became this obsessive. But it was really Peter Brett that inspired me to write. And one of the most wonderful things about being a writer now is I'm actually blurbed on the back of his new book that's coming out. You know, there's complete blank. Terry Brooks, me, and then Naomi Novak on the back of his book. And as a fancy fan, right, I'm just like, oh my God. And I ran through to tell my wife, and she's like, what? Who? You know, just like, what's that mean? But Peter Brett, I think, is amazing. And I love his new books, and I've been lucky to read his latest one, and I think they're great.
That's awesome. It's always really lovely when you find a book that feels like the author just knew exactly what you wanted out of it. And I actually felt very much that way when I read We Are the Dead, because I love dark and military fantasy, and I started reading it, and I was getting amazing female characters. I was getting, you know, this very realistic and brutal world, but with the heavy character driven narrative. And I was like, wow, it's like he knew this is exactly what I wanted to read right now. So thank you for that.
You're more than welcome.
Quinn wants to know, I'd like to know what it's like being on the author end of a broken binding edition. So first of all, congratulations, Mike, because that is also something that happened this last year. The broken binding.
They're beautiful too. Look at this.
Oh, gorgeous. How much the author knows is involved in that, or if it's all the publisher. I mean, so whatever you can talk about.
No, I think there are lots of, it works on lots of different levels. I mean, Matt, who runs Broken Binding, he was a very early supporter of We Are the Dead when he was working at a UK book store called Waterstones, and he got in touch with me and he said that he loved the books and could I send him some signed book plates. And Waterstones weren't carrying We Are the Dead, so which meant it basically wasn't in any bookstores, and he single-handedly sold so many that they then picked it up, which, you know, that alone, I love Matt and is amazing. And then as he started Broken Binding, I obviously sent him more book plates and things like that. I did a little mini comic book with the third book, which I sent him that he could give out to people. So I've done everything I can to support them, and he's been trying for a long time for We Are the Dead to do an edition, and there was a lot of negotiating, and then it became a matter of how many quantity, you know, he thought he could sell and how many Glance wanted him to sell. So that took a bit of time, but it was amazing when it happened, and the books are so beautiful and stunning, and then to go there and sign them and see all these amazing books all stacked up together was incredibly emotional for me. And then I also got to go to his warehouse where he said, is there anything you want to take? And unfortunately, or fortunately for him, obviously I had to fly back to Canada, and I already had, I had 2 sets of these myself, and they're big books. So I got the First Law trilogy. I got his special editions of those because they were the only ones I didn't have in hardback. So that was amazing. And then on the writer business side of it, it's also amazing because I think I've earned out my advances now on these books now because of that. But it also helps me with the next book because I know I've got a sort of fan base that will buy these sort of special editions. That obviously helps going forward. So it is fantastic on lots of different levels.
Yeah. That's kind of the dream as one of the dreams as an author is to see, these really beautiful editions of your book.
I think the thing about writing is I just wanted to see my book in a bookshop. I obviously want to earn enough money to support my family and things like that. But as a writer, you start off because you love books. You go, oh, wouldn't it be great if one day my book was there? And I was really lucky that my agent at the time was a great chap, Robert Dinsdale. But I wanted to be signed by Glance. And if Glance had said, we'll take your book and here's £5, I would have taken it, right? Or $5. I would have gone, yes, sign. Because the dream was to be published by Glance and get my book into bookshops. So, and I'm lucky enough I had him go, whoa, no, we need to,
more than $5.
Do this properly, you idiot.
At least 10.
So on that side, it's just, that is the dream, to see your book and see it on the shelves and everything else. So I think it's amazing now there's so many different ways you can get your books out into the world, whether it's through publishers or by doing it yourself.
Yeah.
And I love to see what the Broken Binding and Grim Oak Press are doing with the print medium too, because as so much of the world moves away from print, they're taking print to the next level.
And
gorgeous copies.
And this I probably can't talk, but there are a lot of opportunities suddenly coming out, which makes things very interesting, very different.
Yeah.
That was a bleak publishing thing.
Steve Westenroth says, that was very moving, Mike. I keep wishing I'd asked my grandparents, especially my grandmother, more about her experiences during the war.
And I think that's, when you're young, aren't you? You're just worried about what present have you got me and where's your bar of chocolate and give me a hug and things like that. You don't. My grandmother, I remember she didn't have any eyebrows. She lost her eyebrows during the war. And I just asked why she had these, she used to paint them on. And I just said, why are they like that? And she said that, but I didn't, okay. But I didn't think, the trauma you must be going through, that where your body starts having that kind of reaction. But, she just gave me a bar of chocolate and gave me a hug, and we had a chat about Star Wars, I think. Actually, what I will say about her, because she's amazing. I went to see Star Wars when it first came out. I was 7 years old at cinema with her. And it turned out she was this massive science fiction fantasy fan. And I remember where she lived, go up the stairs, she had this big bookcase. And she said, well, if you love that film, read this. And she gave me a copy of A Princess of Mars, which is the first John Carter book by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I didn't want to read it because it had princess on the title and the pages were kind of yellow and a bit smelly. And she's like, no, trust me, read it. And I read that and loved it. And then she gave me the next one. And from there, she gave me Tarzan. And from there, she gave me Elric. And she was like my own little personal library of science fiction and fantasy. So she really is responsible for all of this.
That's awesome. I love when, that generation. And now what's so cool about this is now you're kind of carrying that torch forward and hopefully.
Yeah, my kids just want to know why there are all these swear words in it.
How come I can't say that? Yeah. I had to get it in there somewhere, Matt. Brian Bell also says he's very excited to read the trilogy this next year.
Excellent.
I know there's quite a few people I know in my kind of booktube circle that are doing a read along of it this year. So it'll be fun to see more conversation around it this next year.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's been an amazing, and I know great thanks to people like the both of you and Mike's book reviews and things, and everyone who talks about it, because that they came out into the world at a very difficult time. Mm-hmm. And it's the momentum behind the books actually been picking up each year, which often is not the case. Often it's that big burst at the beginning and then they disappear. Mm-hmm. Where there seem to be even more people discovering it now than there ever have been, which is amazing. And the great thing is all 3 books are out there, and I can't even imagine what it'd be like to read them back to back. I think that would almost be a bit too harrowing. Have a nice break.
It's intense.
Yeah, it is intense, but we enjoyed it for sure.
No, I remember when I was binge watching Breaking Bad, and I'd have to watch, a comedy after a couple of episodes because you're just like, I can't take any more. But yeah, I imagine it'd be quite an intense experience.
Yeah. It was, but we readers are weird like that, where we ask for it.
Yeah, well, it's funny because every time there's a new Pierce Brown book out, I reread the whole Red Rising series, and I love them. But again, there's those characters at the beginning where you're just like, oh, you're an idiot. And by the end, you're like, how you dare do that to
if you do anything.
Yeah, terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes me very happy. Red Rising is one of my favorite series of all time. So that makes me very happy that you're also a fan.
I shameless. When Dark Age came out, Pierce Brown, and I will refer to him as Pierce Brown because I'm not on first name terms. Pierce Brown. Pierce Brown came out and he did a signing, and I actually gave him an early copy of The We Are the Dead. And I'm like, I know you're not going to read it, but I love your books, and here you go.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of shamelessly did the same thing. I went to a signing of his in the Twin Cities here in Minnesota, and you get that like 60 seconds when they're signing your book. And I went in there and I said, "Hey, Pierce, do you want to do another BookTube interview?" That was the first thing out of my mouth.
Well, you got
I'm shooting my shot,
Yeah.
So he told me to pester him until he sees the message, and I intend to do that. But yeah, well, a question I have for you on that then too, kind of talking about authors and readers and that there's definitely been in the last few years a lot more kind of osmosis of those two worlds, I think, between readers and authors. And how, as an author, do you really enjoy the opportunity of really being in the middle of what people's discussions about the books are? What do you see as an author, or the kind of the pros and cons of that?
I think everyone is different, right? It depends on what your sanity level's like. I always joke that I always read all my reviews because I don't get bad reviews. And anyone who doesn't like it, it's like it's great. You don't like it, it's fine. They just don't know what they're talking about. But what's great, and particularly when I was at the FantasyCon in Bristol recently, I love talking about books, whether it's my books, other people's books, and stories and things like that. And in my normal life, I have a very humbling family life where my kids are like, "Oh, look, your book's still in the shop. No one's bought it." Not that it's been sold and they brought another one in. They're like, "Oh, no one's bought your book." Yeah. And then if I start talking about characters, they will just look at me like I'm mad. So on that side, it's great. And then really, I am a fan of books, and that's where all of us start from. So to talk about the things we love with people that love the things we love is just a fantastic experience. And I've made so many great friends and met people I like and admire and through this whole thing that I feel very blessed.
Mhm.
I spent most of my life working in advertising, which is full of really egotistical, horrible people, and that's the truth of it, right? There's no, everyone will stab you in the back 2 minutes later. So to be in a business where everyone kind of loves everyone and wants to, oh, if you like my book, you need to read this and check this out, and oh my God, you're amazing. That to me, to be in a thing that's very positive, I think is a very lucky thing to be involved in.
Well said. Well said.
And I still fanboy out to Mark Lawrence and run away.
I do too.
I don't know what to say to him. And I met Anna Smith Spark, and I literally just went, "Oh my God, you're amazing!" Because she writes in a way that I can't write. I think I can tell a story that will travel you along and get you caught up in the story, whereas I could read 10 pages of her talking about someone building a cabin and marvel at the words and the poetry and everything else. And to me, that is a skill level that I could never have. So when I met her, I was like, "Oh my God, you're amazing! And your books are so great." I can't read her books if I'm writing something myself, because I start becoming this like really bad parody of, what I admire in hers. I'm like, no, stop, you can't.
Yeah, she's amazing. Whenever I read one of her books, I just feel compelled to speak it out loud because of the rhythm and the poetry.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Mike, too, about your approach to the magic system in your books. And, you've taken kind of the opposite approach to kind of the classic Lord of the Rings, where, there were the glory days with lots of magic, and now it's all in decay. And you've taken the opposite approach where it's kind of building up in intensity. And I was wondering about, your choices leading to that, and also if that was intending to be like a parallel to something in the real world.
I thought you were going to. I get really nervous about magic systems, only because I have an iPhone. I know what it does and what it's supposed to do, but I don't know how it works, right? And this to me is magic, and I don't care. And to be honest, I don't care how it works. And I know there are people that would, my son's building his own computer and is talking to me about motherboards and this, that. And I'm like, I don't care. I just plug it in, it'll turn on, do your magic. And a lot of that, I started off with magic just wanting to be something that wasn't explained to a certain extent. Because I just imagine if, magic really didn't exist in the world, it was all falling away. And suddenly you've got monsters running at you and demons flying through the sky, and these chosen who are awful Gestapo type figures that can each do something, whatever it is. And I just imagine if that happened to me in the street, I wouldn't be going, "Oh, how'd they do that?" I'd just be wetting myself with fear and panic that it exists, right? So that really kind of where it came from. And I didn't want the good guys to have these superpowered beings right at the beginning that could help things. I needed it to be as dire as possible, which is, and there's a reason why Asgard is called Asgard, because he is this godlike character who really gets shown that maybe he's not quite as tough as he thought he was halfway through, right? And that to me is a lot more interesting. And then even when, in Tinstra, when she starts developing powers, that really comes from drug use and doping and things like that. I always say about Tinstra, she makes all the wrong decisions for the right reasons, right? Because she's doing it out of love and wanting to be able to protect her family that she does this awful stuff. She's not doing it because she wants to, win the Tour de France or something and be famous. She's just doing it because she needs to survive. But and even with the big bad Raku, he may think he's the son of God, but there are an awful lot of leaders in this world that we live in that think they're like God's gift to humanity, and really they're just idiots with egos. And it's up to you whether you think Raku really is the son of a god, or whether he's just this guy that fell into some magic water and got some powers and, you know, was in the right place at the right time. So yeah, that's really where the magic comes from. I mean, I hate books where it's just really over-explained and scientific in its stuff. I like a bit of wonder and how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. And what about the technology aspect too? One of the interesting things I thought was, the presence of kind of, World War I, maybe era sort of military technology, combined with magic too.
Yeah, the first draft actually had guns in it.
Mm-hmm.
They actually had flintlock guns and things like that. And so I was advised to remove them and keep it a bit more basic.
Uh-huh.
And again, really, it was just a matter of what makes it interesting. I wanted, Dren and his crew to have explosives, right? Because it was a way of fighting. How do you fight back against overwhelming odds if you're just on your own? So explosives made it possible.
Mm-hmm.
But I also wanted consequences of using those things. So it wasn't a get out of jail free card and here's millions of them you can just throw around without consequences.
Right.
And again, I think with a lot of technology, particularly when it first comes into the world, that there were soldiers that got sent out into the desert to watch a nuclear bomb go off. You end up blind at the end of that. Oh, you've got cancer. Oh, well, there's that ramifications of it all. I just wanted things that were going to hurt. Whether you're using them or being attacked with them, it needed to feel real in that sense. And I just steal all my ideas from history anyway, so it was,
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch on characters a little bit, John, unless there was something else
Definitely,
you wanted to.
yes.
Okay. So I'm such a character nerd, which is my favorite part of this trilogy. So when you're first starting with a character, how do you go about that character's design? Do they just kind of show up? Do you have kind of a idea of, okay, I need this type of person, or how does that go for you when you first start?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
It's funny because it is, to be honest, it's a mixture of all sorts of stuff. With Tinstra, when I first started writing her, she was this resistance soldier, wisecracking, every cliche that you could probably think about. And she refused to do anything I wanted her to do. Just refused point blank. And I couldn't get the story out. And I just thought, you're being stupid. This isn't a real person. You're writing a cliche. At which when I then thought, well, what would I be like? And I thought, well, I'd be a coward. I'd be hiding in a cupboard. And then I thought, wow, coward in a war story, and she's the hero. That suddenly became really interesting. And the first scene I wrote was her trying to buy the loaf of bread, right? And she's got no money and she's crying. And then Darius walks down the street and blows up a building. And so I wrote that and I was like, wow, this is... And the whole story then came alive. And then I started, well, who is Darius and what would he be like? And I thought, well, if she's petrified, he's got to love what he does, right? This is a man who loves his job. And I knew it was going to be a torturer because that's what the Gestapo did, right? And I thought, well, if he had a magic power, if he could heal people's wounds, right? Like the ultimate be nice. Oh, you're sick, let me make you better. Oh, you're hurt, let me make you better. Well, this guy is just a psychopath, right? So he's using it to prolong torture. And then that kind of came out. And then really, Yaz appeared out of nowhere. I have no idea where she turned up from.
I love Yaz.
I really can't even remember why I put her in the story. Like, there wasn't a plot point. She just became this character that wanted to be written about.
Mm.
And it kind of goes like that, you know. And I can never pronounce his name. Ralasis, the captain, who turns up at the end. I wrote this book 2, and he wasn't really in it. And I just knew there was, and I think at this point I just wanted to kind of have a bit more of a hero character be in it, you know. But again, I wanted, you know, to have someone who was a nice guy, you know, and mainly because Tinstra was going down such a dark road, I needed someone that saw the good in her and wanted to look after her, whereas everyone else was just, you're a bitch and leave me alone. You know, she needed someone that believed in her in a way she couldn't believe in herself. So that's where he came from. And then really when it came to book 3, I made this promise that I was just going to write about 4 characters and keep it tight. But then I was like, wow. And then my editor said, oh, we never saw whoever die at the end of book 2. You know, and I'm like, well, they didn't die. Okay, then so I'm like, so what happened to Wenna? So that's where she came from. And then really Ange was, you know, brokenhearted at the end of book 2. And, you know, all these characters like basically demanded to be written about. So
yeah,
I tried keeping it under control.
That's it. I feel like one of the hats we wear as authors, I apologize for my lighting, I don't know what's going on. But I think one of the hats we wear as writers is cat herders when it comes to the characters, because once we give them that vibrancy in life and they come off the page, all of a sudden they're everywhere and they're telling, okay, I want to be written about, and I want to be written about, and here's this thing about me, and you're like, okay, hold on, I had a plan.
And I'm terrible at planning things. It's funny because and I don't know how much I can get into spoilers because people here haven't read this, but at the end of book 1, Tinstra Zorik had Dren with them at the end of the book, and he was going to go wherever they were going to go. And as I started writing book 2, he became this lost figure that had nothing to do. Right? He literally, and I was very lucky that the book 1 hadn't been published at that point, and I had to ring up my editor and go, I just need to rewrite the last 3 pages. You know, I need to get Dren off this boat. You know, and he needs to go back home. And the moment he did that, suddenly it was a man with a mission, right? And I was very lucky that I managed to sort of save him from that fate that he was going to have. You know, being a tourist in a foreign country sightseeing. You know, so.
That would have been entertaining in some ways, I'm sure. Go ahead, John.
Oh, yeah. So I'm curious. Do you have a favorite character out of all these wonderful characters that you've created?
I love them all. You know, and I really do. Even Darius is a joy to write. You know, because he gets to do these most awful things, and you know, when I came back to writing him again, he was even more evil than he had been the first time. You know, but you know, just I just enjoy that experience, and when it's going well, it feels like I'm just transcribing what's happening rather than this is and this is why I'm a terrible planner, because they become real to me and do the things those characters would do rather than me planning it and forcing them forward along a path, because personalities get in the way, right? And you know, as Mike Tyson said, everyone's got a plan until you get smacked in the face. And that's the same with writing, right? The moment you get into the story and stuff's happening, and you know, you could be alive one page and suddenly you're dead the next, and I'm wondering, why did I do that? You know. So.
Yeah, there's kind of a terrible responsibility there that, you know, as soon as that book leaves your hands and it goes out to everybody else, you're going to have to answer for your choices.
Well, it's really funny because there's there's something that happens to a character at the end of book 3 where it's heavily implied what happens. And I get an awful lot of messages from people going like, Yaz, like, did she, didn't she? And I'm like, well, what would you like to have happened at that? But that's up to, you can read that anyway, but it's really obvious what happened. But they're like, please,
Yeah.
So.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, out of the group, who was the most difficult character for you to write? Or the hardest to wrangle, maybe?
Tinsra was difficult, as I said, at the beginning, but once she got into it, then, none of them were difficult, really. It was just, the only difficulty I ever had was when I went wrong with the story. And I think whenever I have writer's block or I can't move forward, it's my subconscious saying you've gone wrong and you need to backtrack and get back on the right path. And I scrapped about 70,000 words out of book 2 because I'd plowed forward and I'd gone wrong. And I did the same on book 3 as well. And book 3 was the hardest to write because as I was writing it, the pandemic happened and we were all suddenly home and my routine went out and there was all the worry of everything that happened. And I found it very difficult writing a very dark world when reality around me felt really dark and I didn't know what was happening and all sorts of bad life stuff seemed to be happening at the same time as well. So I found book 3 a real struggle to write in that regard as well. And I think when I wrote the first book, it was in such a sort of free flow. Everything was clicking into place and I felt I'd leveled up as a writer and I'd sold them. And then I had this fear of, oh my God, I've written one good book. What if I can't write another good book and I'm going to submit this to my editor and he's going to go, you're shit. We need our money back. And, so I had that fear pushing me on. And then when I was writing the third book, I was like, oh my God, I've got to end this now. And, I originally wanted it to be a 5-book series, because I kind of wanted it over the, World War II was over 5 years. And I thought, well, you could do a year a book and everything else. But the word count basically is the same as 5 books now. They just stuck into the 3 novels. But but again, just trying to tie it all up and make it everyone's, when you have multiple characters, every character has to have their own story that could read as a book in itself. And I needed that to work, and that comes a challenge. You've got 6-7 people to wrangle about, and and that's why Mattion isn't in book 3, right? Because his story's done. He probably didn't live another 2 pages past where you see him at the end of book 2. But it's people. Well, what happened to him? It's well, he's either dead in a ditch or he's doing whatever. But that's the challenge. That was the difficulty, was in just wrangling, or rather than getting them to do stuff.
Yeah, from somebody who is just now beginning to write the first draft of my second book in a trilogy, any advice?
No, I mean, you just got to go with it, haven't you? Just follow your gut and pray that you'll stick around. No, but it's weird because I thought the more books I wrote, the easier they would get to write, and the reality is they get harder with each one. And the fantasy book that I'm writing at the moment, I've actually restarted it I've written huge chunks and restarted it because I want it to be better. And I think that's what, without sounding too pretentious, is what pushes us as artists, is that kind of fear of it not being good enough and I don't know what I'm doing, and you got to be brave and push forward. And then, that pressure only increases with each book that you get and that you work on. And that's why they get harder and harder, and you question why you're doing this. And oh my god! But I lie at night with stories going through my head that I need to get out, and that's why we do it, because it's insanity otherwise. Yeah.
Is there any
good luck? That's my advice.
Thanks.
No. I think the other thing I will say though is, I think if you've got a trilogy in mind, sometimes the middle book is the muddy middle, right? And not a lot happens. And I really worked hard that I wanted the second book, if there wasn't a third, it to be almost satisfying in itself. It needed to feel like stuff had happened, and reading those 200,000 words was worth it, not just something you had to do to get to the last book. And I think there are quite a few trilogies out there where you're kind of like, nothing actually happened, you know, because the status quo is the status quo. And, you know, we've discovered our heroes, we haven't had the big ending, and now they're just wandering around, you know. So I wanted stuff to happen.
Yeah.
Good. Well, you made that happen. Is there anything that you can tell us about your next book? Are you going to go in a completely different direction?
It's romantasy, right? That's what
definitely romantasy. No, but again, I think that throws up. You know, we were talking about this just before we got on for the people watching. But romantic fantasy is the big thing at the moment, and well, that's all publishers want. But I write a certain style of book where there will always be lots of action, there will always be high stakes, and I started off trying to, it's very much a heroic tale. There's a very clear hero in what I'm writing, and then the first scene I wrote involved, you know, mass guillotining of people. You know, so I was like, maybe I'm not falling too far from. My pitch for it is basically Batman with swords and magic.
Nice.
And it's set in a kind of French Revolution world.
Oh, nice.
But it's not the people guillotining the nobles. It's the nobles guillotining the people. But there's a lot of guillotining going on.
Well, I love the pitch. I'm ready for it.
I'm. But again, trying to find the voice of the main character, and it is focused on. It's not a multi-point of view thing, and I'm writing it in first person, present tense, which is interesting in itself. So there are challenges on that side of stuff, but the main hero, to get him right has been the biggest challenge, which is why they're two nearly completed books that will never see the light of day, because he's not been right, and now I think I've got it to a point that I'm really happy.
Nice.
But again, the opening lines, he's getting a noose put around his neck, and you know, that's how we start the story, right? The hero's about to be hung. So it's definitely going to be a Mike Shackle book. It's not going to be a, you know, Love and Roses type thing.
Nothing cozy, huh?
Yeah, I had that experience earlier this year. I was going to write a short story for an anthology, and I thought, okay, you know what? I'm going to try my hand at cozy fantasy. And I wrote like, I think 3 or 4 pages, and all of a sudden it was getting darker. And I was like, well, I tried. Yeah. So, I mean, once you know what your voice is and the type of story that you want to tell, it can be a bit tricky to step out of that. And there's a lot to explore in every voice.
Well, and again, it's where do you find the tension? Where do you find sometimes excitement isn't the right word, but it's you know, if we're telling stories about growth, you know, I always say the story of Captain America is that transformation from spindly Steve Rogers into this hero, and the war setting around that, you know, is just the pressure that makes him go down that road. So you need that pressure. If it was all, you know, happiness and delight from day one, there isn't a story to be told. You need the heartbreak, you need the failed dreams to push you on, and things like that.
John, did you have another one? Otherwise, I'm going to jump over into art.
Go for it, Tori.
Okay. So shoot, hold on. I just rearranged my shelves, so I can't find anything. So Mike sent me very kindly a copy of book 3, which is the one that I read, because we couldn't get it. It was sold out. And when I opened it, I got this amazing hand-drawn yes in the front of my book.
Yeah. I got Jack's.
Right? So I don't ever get drawings like this in the books that I'm sent from authors. Where does visual art feature into your skill set? Because I love this. This is an awesome portrait of Yes.
When I was a kid, I wanted to be a comic book artist. So I've always, look, you can just see all the superheroes and stuff around.
I don't see it. Yeah.
And I collect comic art and things like that. So I love drawing, and to me, it's still something I do when I want to relax and unwind and not think about anything, or if I'm listening to an audio book, it's something I can do at the same time. I do a lot of when I'm designing worlds and characters, I do a lot of doodling and then of just trying to visualize people and things like that. And then really the drawing the books came from me not believing, my signature was enough, right? What can I do to make this even more worthwhile to people? And that's really where it comes from. And it becomes a nice little thing to do. And I normally ask people what their favorite characters are and things like that. So yeah,
I loved it. I was so excited when I opened it.
Too.
Well, no, but it makes you smile and you go, oh, that's actually
it's really cool. Yeah. I love, and now as soon as I saw that, I was like, well, this needs to be a graphic novel, obviously. I would love
this
to
would
see
be amazing as a graphic
amazing
novel. There's I think a Singaporean artist called I'm going to get his name wrong, Guy Wise. I love his work, and he does this amazing samurai stuff. And if ever there was going to be an anime done of my book, I think his look would be what I'd want. I think with some of the plans I've got for the book I'm writing now would involve doing more of a graphic novel stuff around it. And there are actually quite a few illustrations probably on my Instagram. If someone wanted to go digging through that, you can see some of the characters coming to life there.
So did you find that you already had the characters fairly well defined before you were able to draw them, or did the process of drawing them help you to define their personality or their characteristics?
I've got a drawing of Jax in a sketchbook probably 2 years before he became a real character, because I like this idea of a one-armed warrior. Logan Linefingers might have lost a finger, but he can still wield that sword really well. And I thought, well, if you're a swordsman and you've lost your arm, you've got a few problems, and I like that. So yeah, he existed long before there was a story. And the character in the book I'm writing at the moment, I've got drawings of him probably go back 4 or 5 years before I knew anything about what I was going to write next and things like that. So they do pop out in many ways, and sometimes I have things in my head and you can't pay attention to them, so drawing them is a way of acknowledging they exist, and then let yourself, it's a bit like when your kids come up going, daddy, can you? You're like, yes, I hear you, I'll be with you in a minute. It's a bit like that with characters. You're like, I hear you, you want to be acknowledged, you've got a story, just wait your turn. Maybe after dinner we can talk.
Yep. John from Talking Story says, do you plan to revisit this world?
I think the biggest challenge is there are not that many characters alive at the end of it to go back. No, I the answer is probably no. it'd be very doubtful, unless suddenly we sell another 50,000 copies, and there's a demand for it. But I think the tale that's told does its job really well, and the people that are alive, I'd like them to go off and, you know, just do whatever they can do and be happy.
They've earned it.
Yeah, and really to tell any more of their stories, I'd have to put them through hell again, and you know, no one wants to do that.
Just let them have their little field of daisies now.
Exactly.
Yeah. John, also, I mean, kind of answered that a little bit in the project you're working on now, but do you want to talk at all any more about how your love of comics has inspired your writing?
Yeah, I mean, look, I it's really weird seeing how comics are, or particularly movies on comics, are popular now. Because when I was a kid, you were the geeky kid that everyone made fun of. And particularly then when you become a teenager and you're still reading comic books, everyone's like, you know, have you got a problem? So the fact that it's now a major form of storytelling and in entertainment, I you know, 14-year-old me would be very happy. But yeah, I mean, I discovered Marvel when I was 3 or 4. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. And I discovered Star Wars when I was 7, and they, you know, have influenced my life right from then onwards. I always say I've got the taste of an 8-year-old that never grew up. You know, I've got Battlestar Galactica spaceships in front of me and statues of Iron Man and things like that, and I get excited by all this kind of stuff, and I love anything to do with creativity. I enjoy and I get inspired by and things like that. And Jack Kirby and Stanley and all those people are gods to me. So I think they're amazing.
John, did you have anything else on your list?
I think that covers it from my end.
Okay. Well, kind of in closing, Mike, first of all, I want to say a huge thank you for taking some time out of your evening to come over here and spend with us to chat about the books. And it was an absolute blast for both John and I. I think I don't want to speak for you,
Definitely.
John, but
yes, for sure.
that we got to read your trilogy last year, and it's always really fun for us, I think, to be able to take that experience with the story and then be able to hear directly from the person behind it. So thank you for joining us.
No, and no, I've got to really thank you, because I really loved watching your discussions about the books, and I was lurking under a pen name, so you wouldn't see me there. But I was like, wow, they really picked it. You know, it's not often people pick up on some of the more subtler themes that are in the books, and I really valued that as a writer, that you saw it and responded to it. So thank you.
It was our pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Tori and I were a little bit sheepish at first, like, oh, should we reach out to Mike? I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, I'm like this
so
intimidating guy.
What is one thing that I always think is very funny is these authors that write these really brutal, you know, dark stories, and then you meet them like, oh, hi.
Oh, yeah,
know?
I'm nice.
It's awesome. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Everybody in the chat, again, there are links in the description box to both John and Mike's websites, so go check those out. If you haven't already put the Last War, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, The Last War.
Oh, no,
turning in my reviewer card. Please
I actually had someone write when I said something about, you know, great to sign these. He's like, but you didn't write, you know, The Lost War. And I'm like, no, mine's The Last War. Someone else wrote The Lost War.
We know where it is.
Yeah.
But yes, do put it on your TBR, because I know I said this in at least 3 or 4 videos on my channel this last year. I just binged that first book. I was on vacation and I thought, you know, I'm going to take a relaxing vacation read and I'm going to start We Are the Dead.
I had trouble keeping up with her.
Yeah, I think, John, I think you started it first.
I started it first and then you started it after. Like, you were done. And
I couldn't put it down. I think I read it in like 48 hours or something like that, because I could not put it down. And there are a couple of things that I don't know that I'll ever completely forgive you for. So I'll apologize for that right now.
It's all right. I haven't forgiven myself, so it's fine.
At least you know what you did.
Yeah, I do.
But yeah, thank you again so much, Mike, for joining us, and everybody in the chat. Thanks for your questions and for hanging out with us. And here's to an awesome year of writing and reading in 2024.
Excellent. Happy New Year, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.